Thanks, Ethan. Yeah, I made the third piece of the puzzle, and maybe the fourth piece. We had an archaeologist who does archaeology. We had a non-archaeologist who doesn't do archaeology, and I think I'm an archaeologist who doesn't do archaeology. Maybe we'll get a non-archaeologist who does archaeology.
No, he published Artificial Anasazi, so he did archaeology.
He did archaeology a long time ago, as did I. I was an archaeologist a while back, and I'm trying to come up with a measurement. So I wear a bunch of hats. I am at the National Laboratory. I'm at the University of Chicago. I'm technically at Northwestern. Right now I'm at Northern Illinois University mainly. Before I start, though, I want to make it clear that I'm not wearing any of those hats today. They aren't currently funding this research, so I can say my own views, and it doesn't reflect on especially environment. I think that Ross's presentation was actually a very good lead-in to mine. I've got two loose things. Okay. So, because I want to talk about a lot of the same things, but I want to talk about it maybe coming from the other perspective, from looking at archaeology and how we're sort of moving into the space that Ross described. So, we often like to think, or at least I naively thought, that science is pure and abstract and that knowledge is out there waiting to be discovered. And maybe this is true for math. Maybe pi really was out there just waiting for somebody to discover it. But I've come more and more to realize that actual science is really messy. That there are lots and lots of things going on, and we have to make science out of the pieces of it. For this presentation, I'm going to break it up into 4 different components that we have to worry about. We have to worry about data. We have certain data, and we don't have certain data. The amount of data that we have grows over time generally, but we can't do things with data that we don't have. Technology is one that actually is sort of salient for this group. I've been involved in archaeological modeling for a long time. The artificial Anasazi is a sort of venerable thing, but you can't do those kinds of simulation models without the technology that those models are built from. And that technology has grown over the last 20 to 30 years. With the development of object-oriented programming and agent-based models were sort of an extension that grew out of that very easily. Then they began to develop software toolkits for it, like Swarm. I'm involved in developing Repast. But the processing power has increased. You can do larger simulation models than you used to before. You can do high-performance computing models now with millions or billions of agents. And the technology continues to grow, and it will impact our field. So database technology, the way we store data, the way we organize data, artificial intelligence is coming, visualization techniques, but also machine learning, natural language processing. All of these are changing the kinds of science that we can do. Meanwhile, we do science with a theoretical toolkit as well. So I've listed some domains of theory in there that have shifted over the last years. So social theory changes, complexity theory, resilience, network analysis, things that Ross was just talking about. In archaeology, of course, we've moved cultural history to processual, to behavioral, to selectionist, to post-processual, theme theory, actor network theory. All of those things are things that affect the way that we can think about our data and the way that we can do our science. Models versus theory and philosophy of science, Ross alluded to these as well. There's sort of a very long arc of history relating models and theory from the sort of logical positivism, the Vienna School, up through the shift to a semantic approach to theory. And the role that models occupy in that has changed over time. And we've been sort of having to reconcile our computational approaches with our modeling approaches against that. Meanwhile, we also do science in a world. And the world has an impact on what we do. So listing things down there in the bottom section, climate change, economic challenges, terrorism, movement of peoples, disease, global conflict. These are the challenges that our science is asked to address. These are the challenges that we get funding for, and these shape the kinds of questions that we ask out of our data. All of that shifts through time, and we have to surf along with it. So the question of what can we learn from the past isn't sort of an abstract thing. The question is, what can we learn from the past now? Given the tools that we have, given the data that we have, given the kinds of questions that we're interested in asking, what can we do? So we have some guidelines. We have some things in this sort of modeling tradition Model-based archaeology of socio-natural systems that came out about a decade or so ago is one of the touchstones of the Artificial Societies book. You can dive into the philosophy of science with literature. I love the models as mediators. It's the M&M book because it's by Mary Morgan and Margaret Wilson, or the other way around. Lots of M's, but also lots of good discussion of just exactly what are we doing to create models and how do models interact with our theory. The problem is we don't have all that worked out. When you really start to push what is modeling and how does modeling work in the conduct of science, you get into areas where things get very fuzzy. And I'm not going to go into that in detail, but it does have an impact. So let's talk about archaeologists. I'm affiliated with a group called IHOPE. And IHOPE is the Integrated History and Future of People on Earth. The F didn't fit in the acronym, so it's just IHOPE. But they're a group of archaeologists who are dedicated to this idea that we can learn from the past, and we can use the knowledge that we gain from archaeology to make a better future. Beautiful thinking. Lately, IHOPE has been associated with CSynC, which is the Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center. It's operated by the University of Maryland. It's funded by National Science Foundation in the US. And they've been hosting a series of workshops to explore this idea in a little more detail. So workshops are all in if the past teaches, what does the future learn? Now, I will say that there are 3 workshops, October of 2018, April 2019, that's last week, and then coming up again in October 2019. And I don't want to spill the tea. I don't want to throw any of my colleagues under the bus. A lot of this is still formative, so there are some ongoing things. But I am going to talk a little bit about the challenges of running these workshops. And I'm going to do it in this context of how we learn from the past. So in the October workshop, we brought together 2 groups of archaeologists, the Meso-P and the Meso-A, Mesopotamia and Mesoamerica. And we asked them specifically to look at ancient urban forms. This sort of ran into 2 roadblocks. One is wet versus dry environment, and there was a big division between that. But the other, which was kind of unexpected, was this question of what kind of lessons are we learning from the past? Are we learning very specific lessons, like in this place you can farm this way, and they did it 3,000 years ago, and you can do it again today to recover your fields from the damage that Saddam Hussein did? Or are we talking about something much more general, like if you have a diversified portfolio of resource management strategies that you can shift from one to the other, then you will be able to withstand a changing environment better. One of those is very specific and grounded in a particular context, and the other is a general lesson that you can take anywhere in the world. The group did not see eye to eye on which kind of lesson we were trying to get. Another thing that we did, though, was we tried to use this adaptive cycle concept, the Holling, the alpha, rho, K, and omega. It's a process through which adaptive systems might go. It's drawn from ecology. It's applied sort of widely in archaeology, but often loosely, and it's kind of fuzzy in a lot of places. So we ended up tossing it, essentially, and invoking our own concept of durability. This notion of we want things that are able to persist in time, even though they face lots and lots of challenges through time. We want cities that last. So that's a part of our theoretical toolkit that we found inadequate and we started having to develop our own. So then last week, we had the second workshop. And this one, we brought together archaeologists from lots of different contexts, not just Meso-P and Meso-A, but other places in the world. And we added an additional challenge. We brought some landscape architects, some urban planners, basically. And we made this claim: planning for future cities can learn from the past. And this is exciting because prove it. Bring a bunch of archaeologists together, let them bring their data sets, show me a lesson from the past that you learned that we can apply to the future. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the challenges. We had challenges in this. We had the specific versus general again. We had a bunch of anthropologists in the room, so we had to talk about voice and were we representing the indigenous views of the cities well enough, and was that going to impact our conceptions? And we also were kind of focused on climate change. We were privileged to have Marcy Brockman along with us, Recently, the National Park Service now working with IPCC and other organizations. And she is very focused on the challenges that cities are going to face in terms of climate change. That wasn't the only kind of challenge, so we sort of wavered between those. But the sort of bigger issue is this notion of how to improve lessons from the past for these future urban planners. So I've got this bizarre looking diagram in keeping with my museum theme. 4 things. So the biggest square is all the ways that people might live in the future. That's the big outer green square. And the sort of bluish square is a smaller square, ways people lived in the past. So you expect more ways in the future because things change and we should be able to build on what we did. That's not quite good enough because we only know a certain subsection of the ways people lived in the past. And then the most challenging is the red section, which is kind of like our challenge is that we have to give landscape architects things that they don't already know. Another way to look at this is if you can learn it by looking at contemporary cities, then you don't need to learn it from the past. So you can rule out all the cities that actually still exist. For our challenge to make good on our promise that you have to learn from the past, you have to look at non-existent cities today that you've got through archaeology, or at least bring something to landscape architects that they don't already know. So here's the challenge. Well, one thing that you can do is you can say that there are some things that happened in the past that will not be applicable in the future. They sort of move out of the big green square. Part of that is because aspirational. There are a lot of things in the past that we don't want to go back to. I'm not going to advocate that we have a slave-driven society or any of the other wonderful things that have happened in the past that we are actually better leaving behind. But part of it is also because the world is changing. Solutions that worked in the past may not necessarily work in the future if you are facing different conditions. So you slide some of those boxes out of the future and block them off as exclusively in the past. Problem is, which world do we live in? So on the left, there's a world where the future is largely occupied by strategies that have already been tried in the past. We know about almost all of them. And landscape architects don't know about them because we know better. So we have this big red target to hit. And that's one way that it might work out. But the other way on the right is very different. Things in the future are going to look extremely different from the past. We only know a slice of them. And we don't know everything about the past. We might know most of it, but then landscape architects might also already know most of it as well. So in that world, we don't have that much to draw from, to learn from the past, because the lessons are already on the table or they don't apply. Now, which world do we live in? Here's where I'm going to make an odd argument. It depends on how you model. If your only answers are 2, people will either live in cities or they don't. They live in disaggregated environments. Then your space is very small and it gets filled up very easily and quickly. On the other hand, if you look at every city as unique, as a different kind of strategy, then you might be able to find many more degrees of latitude from which to draw these lessons. But all of this is getting back to this modeling theory question. How do we draw the level of abstraction when we're looking at these clusters? What are we calling a strategy? How are we defining each of those little axes that we want to work on? How are we finding new and workable things in the past? And all of that has to do with essentially how we model it. So modeling can then be a way that we can move from the sort of known areas into unknowns. And if we get our act together, which we should, figure out how to use these models to test things that aren't attested in the archaeological past, to test the boundaries on what will work and won't work in conditions that we've never seen before, to push things into the future in ways that we can't foresee at the moment. And in a sense, to take a little bit larger role, not just in guessing at the future, but in actually helping to design it. So, as we are continuing to move forward, we can bridge all of these things together, but only if we start to tie all of these different strands into a nicer bow than they're linked in now. So what Ross was talking about is how it's played out in health sciences and biology, and how it's played out in economics. The process in archaeology is going to be different because archaeology is a different field and addresses different questions. But it is going to be one that it's one that we are still working through, and it's going to be one that requires a fair amount of care because of the different ways that we apply models in the past to learn about the archaeological record and to take that archaeological record and transform it into things about the future. See.